We had an excellent start with that first session looking at the war on terror, and now we go on to another one that's also very provocative. And I hope you're ready now, after those refreshments, to get into the debate on the Arab Spring, guided chaos or awakening democracy. For that, we have a journalist who covers the Arab world and beyond for Russia Today. I'd like you to please give a warm welcome to the TV network's Middle East Bureau Chief and Correspondent, Paula Sear, and she will also be bringing up her panelists.
I'd like to ask for all the panelists in this session to please come up now. So, Makram. There you are. Great. And Gaydar. Like many of you, I'm staying across the road at the, please come up. Thank you. Like many of you, I'm staying across the road at the Rixos Hotel, and it reminds me of my last stay at a Rixos Hotel, which was last year, March, April, in Tripoli, Libya. At that stage, there were about 300 foreign journalists in this hotel, and I'm sure you all know the stories as well as we do. We couldn't leave the hotel without having one of Gaddafi's men following us around. They used to call press conferences, sometimes at 11 o'clock at night, 12 o'clock at night, and more often than not, it was just to tell us how Gaddafi was still in control and how the government was not in any way showing any chance of collapsing. If you would have told any of us who were in Libya then that in a few months' time the regime of Colonel Gaddafi would be over, we wouldn't have believed it. I remember once going out to do a story, and as I say to you, we had these minders with us all the time. And we'd gone onto a side street in Tripoli, and we'd managed to walk a little bit away from some of these people who were watching our every word. And we started talking to a young woman who started speaking quite freely, and said that no, she did not support Gaddafi, and she really felt that there needed to be some kind of regime change in her country. And as she was talking, I could see these minders walking slowly closer and closer to us. Within a few moments, they quietened her, they took us away and put us in the van, and I saw out of the corner of my eye them putting her into a van. Now, I never did find out what happened to that young woman, but she is just one of the countless people who has been affected and whose story has not yet been told by this so-called Arab Spring. So much has happened in the world since the 17th of December 2010, when a young Tunisian vendor set himself on fire. But how much of what has happened in this so-called Arab Spring has been a real spring? How much of it has fulfilled the wishes and hopes of people who took to the streets? Or how much of it is a reactionary process being controlled by outside forces? And this is the topic that we're exploring in this session. The Arab Spring, guided chaos or awakening democracy. Now with me, I have an esteemed panel. They are John Bennett Johnston, a former US Senator from Louisiana, and Chairman of Johnston & Associates, Arik Bahar, Secretary General of the Israel Press Council, Maxim Shevchenko, host of the In the Context show on Channel 1 Russia, Gaydar Jamal, Chairman of the Islamic Committee of Russia, and Dr. Makram Khoury Mahul, a Cambridge-based scholar. We also have a number of experts in the audience, and I'll introduce them and call on them as we go along. I'd like to ask everyone, and we will open shortly for questions, to please keep your questions and your statements and your reflections as short as possible so that we can get as many points of views discussed and we can get a real debate going. Makram, I'd like to start with you. We all talk so freely of the Arab Spring. Is it the right terminology? Is there really such a thing as the Arab Spring?
Thank you, Paula. I'd say that terminology is very important. Semantics clearly play a very important part in political campaigns, especially when these political campaigns are international. Sometimes the public or laymen may use terms naively, but they only repeat them. They repeat them after they have heard them in the media, when they have already been introduced by strategists of international politicians through the media. There is a tradition in the Arab world to follow, and this is exactly what is happening, or what happened even with the concoction of the name in the Middle East. It's always in relation to where the Arab world or that part of the world stands in geographical relation to the West. So, as well as the name, the Middle East, so is the so-called Arab Spring. It was a term which was introduced by Orientalist Westerners, which I clearly think that it has nothing to do in what has been happening in the Arab world. I would rather academically prefer the description. I wouldn't even say definition, because this would take some time, only the description of unfolding events. And clearly, sorry Paula, clearly if we go back to the Arabs, we have got a huge body of Arabic poetry, and part of the genres in Arab poetry is called Sha'r al-Wasf, or descriptive poetry, where the description of spring is quite broad, and I assure you that starting from the most celebrated poet, Al-Mutanabbi, up to the most recent poets, nobody would have called what has been happening in the Arab world Arab Spring.
So what has been happening in the Arab world? Do you think it was planned? Or do you think it was something spontaneous?
Here, it's always important to get into what we call in political sociology processes. Only when we understand processes that we get to understand what has been happening in the Arab world. And clearly there have been and there are economic inequalities and social injustices, but these would not have spread at all in the nature that they have spread had we not have international intervention, and in particular finances, budgets and logistics to move and to bolster perhaps the mood of the nation. And here I'd like to perhaps use the definition of Joseph Goebbels, just to borrow one, that there is a difference between the Haltung and Stimmung, to those who understand German, i.e. between the situation and the mood. You can play with the mood through propagandistic campaigns, but you cannot change the situation through sloganeering and spin, what the spin doctors do to terminology.
Gaydar, I'd like to bring you in here. You have said that there have been powerful international clans, such as the United Nations, the European Union, and NATO, who want to see sovereignties done away with. Why? What is their ultimate goal?
First of all, I would right away go against the term of Arab Spring, for that term was given by Westerners, but in fact in the region they use a term of Islamic awakening. Let me remind that in Tehran a standing conference was called on the theme of Arabic awakening, and that Tehran was supporting revolutions in the Arabic countries of Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, and in Yemen. One problem was only around Syria due to a very specific set of reasons related to geopolitical status of that country. The Arab awakening, or rather the Islamic awakening, is something that was projected a long time ago. Naturally, it doesn't have an Arabic, but has an overall Islamic meaning and scale. Prior to the Islamic Revolution in Iran, back then, many have worked that Pakistan would be the first one of those. In 1970s, Pakistani immigration was very active in this effort. They were counting that revolution would take place sooner than in Iran, but due to several reasons, it never happened. And I'd like to say that in the course of many decades, political Islam in all these countries was fighting against national socialism led by Gaddafi, Mubarak, before that Sadat, and before that Nasser, by the way, who was adored by many in the secularized part of the society, but who had actually done more harm to his people than real success. Than brought real success. And in fact, these leaders, they were part of the Western establishment, which had appointed or set up these figures in those positions at the time when the British Empire had to be kicked out from its positions in the Middle East. The Arabic National Socialism was a tool of fighting aristocratic traditional establishment. However, now the time is coming when political Islam is acting at the same time against traditional Sufi systems related to inheriting power and against secularist presidential bureaucracies, and like I said before, in the international bureaucracy's agenda that no longer wants to stand this clearly set up organized bureaucracy in the national sovereignties, in the agenda of national bureaucracy and the political Islam match. That doesn't mean that they will do so for long. For instance, in Libya, murdering the American ambassador shows that this convergence of these political trends was very brief, momentarily. It was very limited. And that's how it is today. But many perceive it that the West allegedly manipulated the process in the Middle East. That's not how it is. The West used it, but it did not manipulate it, it did not prepare it, it just tried to enter it, saddle it, and use it. And it also has to be said that this process is multifaceted and very sophisticated. For instance, when the fight against Assad started in Syria, Ikhwan al-Muslimin in Syria were the dominant group that practically were the first to take the burden of fighting the Ba'athist regime. I prefer to call it not Alawite, but Ba'athist.
Gaydar, let me come in here because I want to bring John in. John, the point was made that sometimes the West uses the situation and doesn't manipulate it. You authorized the use of military force in Operation Desert Storm in Iraq in 1991. What for you are the criteria for when there should be foreign intervention?
Well, it is very difficult to set a general rule for foreign intervention. I thought Desert Storm was rather clear in that Saddam Hussein had invaded a sovereign country. It violated every norm of international law. There was a strong international coalition made up not just of Western powers, but Arab countries as well, whose purpose was to restore the status quo ante. It was not to take over Iraq. Indeed, when Kuwait had been restored to its own sovereignty and Saddam Hussein had been defeated, you will recall that we did not, the Desert Storm Coalition did not go into Baghdad, did not seek to subject the country to our rule. Rather, it was to restore. Let me hasten to say that had I been in the United States Senate in the second Iraq War, I would have voted no. I think that was a mistake. I think that history shows it was a terrible mistake. But it is very, very difficult to have general rules that are applicable in all situations. I mean, the situation in Syria today is so different from the situation in Libya and every other country that it is very hard to make general rules. But Desert Storm was very clear, I think, by almost general understanding.
Maxim, would you agree with that? Would you say that there are situations when foreign intervention is justified, or do you think that one really can say that it's never justified and it's always an excuse under the blanket of defending human rights or advancing peace?
Вы знаете, я вообще скажу такое.
You know, I would say something blasphemous. I think a state in the modern world is a pretty conditional thing. It's a territory controlled by a pool of bureaucracy, and the status of a state depends on whether this pool of bureaucracy recognized as having jurisdiction on that territory by the so-called world power center. It could be US, it could be some EU or some international community. So the question whether it's justified or not, when it, for me, I believe immediately makes people choose, take one position. Practically now we are saying, we speak as if history started just a few years ago, but no. In 1949, the matter whether it was justified under the UN flags, Korea, which had great tragic, when they say over 1 million people died, at least the North Korea and the People's Republic of China claim against them all kinds of weapons were used. Was it justified back then? The assault in the south of the Korean peninsula, or entry of US Army in Saigon, South Vietnam, the battle of Vietnam and all those atrocities that Americans have committed, or was Soviet Army's intrusion in Afghanistan justified? When a powerful country that has some sort of coalition tries to justify its intervention, and then it turns out that whoever, he who wins is right. It turns out we say Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, but if we are to look into the sources of those years, we see that Saddam Hussein was referring to the US sanction to take under control Kuwait, which was considered by them as a province of Iraq, which in that unstable situation received some independence, and that generally many Middle Eastern countries, maybe with the exception of Egypt, that has ancient integral history, are all part of a very recent history. Just 100 years ago, they were either part of Ottoman or Ottoman or Persian Empire, then they were under French or British mandate or some other mandate, and their age is just decades. So it seems to me that the process of nation building in the Middle East, with the exception of Egypt, let me emphasize it again, it's a special country with special history, both political and it has its own political history of millennia. That nation building process is not yet over. Moreover, due to support or legitimacy of the international community, that path was walked by Israel, which is also an extremely young Middle Eastern country, which is what, a little over 60. And even then, we see Israel's territory, it expands, then it shrinks, some lands are recognized as legitimate, and then they're not recognized. So, going back to intervention, I think that colonialism has not disappeared. The